In our approach to Jewish life, Jewish literature is more expansive than simply the Torah. And so if we choose to read from Jewish literature as part of our Shabbat celebrations, we are not confined to the Torah portion of the week. In this case, I am choosing a reading from the Torah, beginning with Leviticus 24, and then looking at a broader understanding of Torah, even in a traditional context, by exploring the Talmudic discussion of the law presented here in Leviticus 24. And as you'll see, this is an entree to our topic of Jews and money, because what began as an ethical, moral justice question turns into a money question when the rabbis begin to discuss it. Here we have, beginning in verse 17 of Leviticus 24, a famous law, the law of lex talonis. If anyone kills any human being, he shall be put to death. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, life for life. The Hebrew is yishalmeno. He will pay for it. If anyone maims his fellow, as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. One who kills a beast shall make restitution for it, but one who kills a human being shall be put to death. So here we have what seems like a very straightforward rule. You cause physical damage to a person, that same physical damage is done to you. And it gives several examples. Breaking for breaking, or fracture for fracture, eye for eye, shin tachat shin, tooth for tooth. The same injury will be given to the one who inflicted it. Now, when the rabbis get this law as their inheritance, they are faced with a choice. They are not interested in imposing capital punishments on people's bodies. They also don't have the power to impose physical death on people. They don't have the power of the death penalty anymore by the time the rabbis are debating these laws they've inherited. And so they decide they need to interpret. They need to find a way to deal with this question of causing damages, but in a way that avoids the physical confrontation. And so, as we'll see, they change the terms of the discussion. So here we have, first in the Mishnah, which is a collection of rabbinic law dating to the year 200 of the Common Era and before, so about 200 BCE to 200 CE, in that 400-year window. The rabbis of that generation came up with this concept. One who wounds his neighbor is liable to pay the following 5 things: damage, pain, healing, loss of time, and disgrace. But the word they use for to pay is lishalem, to pay money, not to pay with blood or suffering. Damage, what does that mean? If he blinds one eye, cuts off his hand, or breaks his leg, the injured person is considered as if he were a slave sold in the market, and he is appraised as his former and his present value. In other words, if you were on the slave market and you would have been sold with 2 eyes, and then if you went on the slave market only having 1 eye, what would be the difference in value? That's the price of an eye. That's the fine to be paid for damage. But that's just one of the areas one must compensate for. Second is pain. If he burns him with a spit or with a nail, or even if only the nail of his hand or foot, where it produces no wound, it is appraised how much a man his equal would take to suffer such pain. How much would you pay to let someone do this to you? How much would you get paid, rather? And someone of his equal station, what would he be willing to do? That would be the value of the pain suffered. Healing. If he caused him bodily injury, he must heal him. If pus collected by reason of the wound, he must cause him to be healed. If not by reason of the wound, he is free from that. If the wound heals up and breaks out again, even several times, he must pay for it. He must cause it to be healed. If, however, it heals up thoroughly once, he's no more obligated to heal it. So medical expenses is also included in the payment for damages. Loss of time. The injured person is considered as if he were a watchman of a pumpkin field, as he was already paid the value of his hand or foot. That is, you were paid for the damage that was done to the body. You were paid for the pain. You were paid for the medical expenses. Loss of time, well, if you had just sat there watching pumpkins grow, the minimum wage, that's what your loss of time is worth. and the disgrace is appraised with consideration of the station and rank of the one who causes, as well as the one who suffers. So as much as we like to think that Jewish law was an advance over the Hammurabi Code, which differentiated between nobles and peasants with giving consequences, here the rabbis bring back the concept of class, where you consider the station and rank of the person who did the damage, as well as the one who suffered it, before you decide how to apportion payment for disgrace. Now, this next part, which begins with the word Gemara, this is the completion of the Mishnah. This is later commentary by the rabbis of the next few hundred years, from 200 of the Common Era till approximately 550, 600 of the Common Era, who continue to discuss this issue. And in fact, they begin with the question that should be on your mind right now. What about Leviticus 24? What about the passage that says an eye for an eye? Perhaps it is to be taken literally. For scripture reads, quoting from the book of Exodus, where similar laws appear, eye for eye. The anonymous editor here says, this cannot enter the mind. It's impossible to literally mean eye for eye, because we've learned in the following rabbinic saying, lest one says, if he blinds one's eye or cut off one's hand, the same should be done to him. Therefore it is written in the following verses, and he that killeth a beast shall make restitution for it. And he that killeth a man, etc., as the verse continues. As in the case of a beast, only the value is paid, so also in the case of a man. And lest one say, didn't it say about killing people? If they killed, life for life? Now we find a passage in Numbers. Moreover, you will take no redemption for the person of a murderer who is guilty of death. Well, you might say from this very verse, you can get no redemption for a murderer, but redemption money is to be taken for one who destroys parts of the body that cannot grow on again. That is, you only take redemption for killing him. You have to kill the person. That's the death penalty. But other than killing him, you can take money instead. I mean, what you see out of this is they're trying to manipulate the text to get to the answer of money, because they don't want to deal with the reality of causing corporal damage to somebody. And they actually give a very reasonable example in the next section. We've also learned in a Baraita and outside teaching, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, eye for eye means its value. You say its value, maybe it means literally. No, what should be done when a blind man blinds another? That is, if someone is already blind and they knock out one person's eye, what are you supposed to do? Blind him again? He's already blind. What if somebody with one eye knocks out the eye of somebody with two eyes? You're going to make him totally blind? That's not a fair compensation. It just becomes almost impossible to make it fair when you're dealing with corporeal. Look, it's impossible to make it fair with money too. But at least you don't get into irreversible damages. Unless one say this case is an exception, it goes on. Therefore, scripture reads, one manner of judicial law you will have, which means a law that can be applied alike to all human cases. And the school of Rabbi Ishmael continues. Scripture reads, and so on, it should be given unto him. And by given is meant a thing given from hand to hand. So I can't give you the cutting off of an eye, but I can give you money. The school of Rabbi Ishmael further down deduce it from another verse. It says, if a man cause a bodily defect in his neighbor, as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Why repeat it again in the next verse? To indicate that it means money. At the end, the verse, scripture desired to use a term to be deduced, it means money, and so it uses the same term here. Or one other example, the school of Rabbi Chia. You see these different warring schools of interpretation. The scripture reads in Deuteronomy again, the same law appears. Yad tachat yad, hand for hand. That means something that can be passed from hand to hand. In other words, not an eyeball, but money. Now, is this an advance in law? I would argue yes, because corporal punishment is the kind of justice we see sometimes in Saudi Arabia or Iran, where they cut off a thief's hand. We find it distasteful. Branding, flogging, all of those are beyond what we should accept as what we would consider civilized justice these days. And yet it brings it back to money. If you were an anti-Semite reading this, you would say, you see, the Jews are all about money. But if you're a scholar of history reading this, or even an ethicist reading this, you would say this is a step forward. Does it accept slavery? Of course, remember, that's how you evaluate the value of an eye. It depends on slavery. So it is not perfect. But is it progress? Well, I think it is. And so sometimes moving from physical damage to money is a step forward. It's a step away from the literal into the symbolic. And sometimes that's a step in the right direction.
Oh, dear Lord. You made many, many poor people. I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor. But it's no great honor either.
Well, Fiddler on the Roof is one expression of Jews and money. What do we hear in that song? We hear a desire for comfort and ease, a desire for predictable food. If you read the original Tevye stories, he's on the verge of starving, as is his entire family. We hear class resentment because he is a have-not and he looks up at the haves. We hear the power of money to confer dignity. People will all of a sudden ask him advice because they think you really know when you have money. And what will the sweetest thing of all be? That he will have the time he lacks as a working man to sit in the synagogue and pray. Maybe have a seat by the Eastern Wall, which of course he could donate to get his name on, so he could always sit there. And he could discuss the holy books with the learned men 7 hours a day. That would be the sweetest thing of all, to have the leisure to pursue his highest ideals. So money was power, money was status. Interesting, he doesn't mention giving tzedakah or charity. But after all, this was not a song written in Eastern Europe. This was a song written for Broadway in America. And so they actually soft pedal the class conflict in the Tevye stories, in Fiddler on the Roof, the musical that was meant to play on Broadway, because it's the American dream. It's aspirational. I could be a rich man. I could be whatever I wanted to be, says the American dream. And in this case, Tevye says, what I would like, if the universe could arrange to have it, would it be so bad if I were a wealthy man? Now, as I alluded to at the beginning, Jews and money is thought to be a very dangerous topic. It can be the basis of anti-Semitic accusations, as it has been for centuries, and even today. For example, the translation of "If I Were a Rich Man" into Hebrew when Fiddler on the Roof was played in Israel was "Lu Hayiti Rothschild," if I were Rothschild, because the Rothschild family and their fabulous wealth had become synonymous. So much so that when a company owned by the Rothschild family had a satellite orbiting that produced lasers to study the Earth, it became the basis for an anti-Semitic conspiracy that the Rothschild had started the California wildfires. This is the origin of that claim that there were Jewish space lasers causing damage. And here we have just one example of a representation of a Jewish space laser. Now, I have to say that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's most famous for this claim, may not have even known that the Rothschild family was Jewish. She just thought they were rich and they were power brokers and they were the elites and they were globalists, and therefore they were dangerous. It's not always clear that people complaining about globalism are anti-Jewish, or people complaining about the influence of money are anti-Jewish. And we also know that this is not only a problem from the right side of the political aisle. So I'm going to share with you now a somewhat disturbing image. I'll say at the outset. This was shared on Twitter by the head of the Philadelphia chapter of the NAACP in July of 2020. To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. And he included pictures of 3 people who had gotten into trouble for saying anti-Jewish things recently. Now, this person, Rodney Muhammad, himself got into trouble for sharing this. You can imagine why. And you'll notice if you look carefully at the drawing, it's not just that you have this horrible Nazi version of the Orthodox Jew with the large nose and the ugly teeth and the beard and the scheming hands, but the hand that's oppressing those people down below has a beautiful, sparkling diamond pinky ring on it. Well, this one was hard to spin. Even though Muhammad tried to defend himself and ultimately could not, he ultimately stepped down. And the national NAACP, to their credit, stepped in and forced him to do so because they said this is unacceptable in no possible way. But another example that's often brought to the fore is a statement made by the representative from Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, who once was complaining about the influence of the pro-Israel lobbies like AIPAC and others And she said, it's all about the Benjamins, which is a quote from a rap song. Now, the question is she saying that it's Jewish money that's doing this? Or is it lobbyist money that's doing this? Well, those who want to criticize her will say she's obviously talking about the Jews. Those who would defend her say, well, she inartfully is talking about lobbying money. But this becomes the dilemma. If we're afraid to even approach the possibility of discussing anything close to Jews and money, that means we're not understanding an important part of Jewish history, of Jewish culture, and the Jewish experience. How did Jews earn a living? What are Jewish demographics when it comes to things like college education and average income? These are facts. They do not have to be evil. Consider the subtle difference between these two statements. Many Hollywood power brokers, like studio heads and agents, are Jewish. That's one statement. The second statement is, the Jews run Hollywood. You see, the first statement, that many Hollywood power brokers are Jewish, that is sociology. The Jews run Hollywood, that is anti-Semitism. So we have to look at a history of Jews and money, aware of the dangers, but not limited by them. I want to give us an honest look through Jewish history of the relationship of Jews to money, how they earned it, how they spent it, how they gave it away, and everything in between. Now, Jewish culture began 3,000 years ago in an urbanizing period where the Hebrew people were beginning to move from nomadic herdsmen or farmers with an ancestral land toward more city-connected settings. Think about the story of Cain and Abel as a mythological origin story. You've got the farmer who is Abel, you've got the shepherd who is Cain. I'm sorry, the shepherd is Abel, the farmer is Cain, and guess what happens? It doesn't turn out very well. In fact, Cain kills Abel. So the rivalry between settled agriculture and nomadic farming goes back a long time. You can also hear it in the musical Oklahoma, where they sing, "Oh, the cowman and the farmer should be friends," but of course they're not. So this shift from being tied to a city, even if you had fields outside that you would go inside the city for protection, made a lot of changes, because now it wasn't just growing your own food, it was doing other things and trading for food or trading for that substitute that became agreed upon, be it gold quills or gold or silver or artificial currency or whatever the society decided would serve as the go-between for an exchange. You now begin to get craftsmen. You have merchants. We're dealing with money problems, and that includes problems of wealth inequality, issues of borrowing at interest, and problems that we still face even today. We just saw in the passage we read earlier from Leviticus and then in the Talmud, debating how to handle damages when we're not in a tribal, you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you, but we're in a system of justice with monetary fines. And how does that translate the old values into the new context? And so here's a passage from the book of Leviticus, which explores this question of how to keep things fair and equal in a world where some have money and some do not. Leviticus describes something called the Jubilee, that on the 50th year, that is after 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year is extra special. In fact, I'll point out that a Jubilee sabbatical year is coming up this fall. This next year will be one of those 7 and 50 years to mark. You will make the 50th year holy and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a Jubilee to you, and you shall return to his own property, each of you return to his family. So if you were a hired servant somewhere else, if you were not owning your own ancestral land, you get it back. It's a Jubilee you don't even plant. The land will produce its good for you. If you sell anything to your neighbor, this is verse 14, or buy from your neighbor, you will not wrong one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you buy from your neighbor, according to the number of years of the crops he will sell to you. That is, if you know that the Jubilee is coming, you're in year, let's say 42, and you buy the land, you're only buying 7 years worth of harvests. And you know that, so you price it accordingly, because you know it's going to go back to its ancestral owner. According to the length of years, you increase the price, and the shortness of the years, you diminish the price. He's selling the number of harvests to you. So now the land shall not be sold in perpetuity. The land is mine, says God. You are strangers and live as foreigners. You're just residents. I own it. In all the land in your possession, you grant a redemption for the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells his possession, then his kinsman who comes next redeems what his brother has sold. But if he isn't able to get it back for himself, in verse 28, then what he has sold remains in the hand of him who has bought it until the Jubilee, and then it is released. The idea is totally foreign to our concept of capitalism. You can never permanently sell anything. You're simply renting it for a period of time, and then it goes back to the ancestral owner. Now, that's for farming. If a man sells a home in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it's been sold. He can have the right of, he can buy it back within a year. But if he doesn't do that within a year, then the house in the walled city is made sure in perpetuity to him who bought it. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. If you're in a village without a wall, or if you're in the countryside and it's farming land, that goes back to you in the Jubilee. But a house in a city is different. It's now private property that can be permanently sold. Now, they are certainly aware that some will be rich and some will be poor. If your brother has become poor and his hand can't support himself, you uphold him. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. So if you're feeding someone, don't exploit the hungry by charging extra. Give him the food at cost, basically. And even more important, if you're lending him money, you give him just the money and he pays back just the money. You do not lend money at interest. This is also a provision in Islamic law, by the way. Of course, it's totally impractical in a capitalist economy where you need to borrow money, but the person lending you the money should be paid some consideration for that. That's the whole concept of lending at interest, because there's a risk involved. What if you take the money and blow it on gambling or on alcohol, which existed back then, by the way? Well, if that's the case, then the person who lent you the money has to have some possibility of getting back more because of the risk involved. Or if you're sending a caravan out somewhere or sending a ship across the sea, the concept of interest is basic to a capitalist economy. And this is a pre-capitalist system because they see lending money at interest is like exploiting the hungry for food. Now, when you have someone so poor that they sell themselves as a servant, they are not a slave. They're a hired servant. He serves until the year of Jubilee, and then he leaves and goes back to his own family. Now, just to be candid here, your male and female slaves that you get from the nations around you that are not Hebrews, those you can buy as slaves. And the aliens who live among you, the resident aliens, you can buy them too, and their kids. They'll be your property. You can make them an inheritance for your children after you to hold for a possession. Of them, you may take your slaves forever. But the children of Israel, of them, you only rule up to a point, up to the Jubilee. So it's anti-slavery for Hebrews, but it's certainly accepting chattel slavery in its worst form for non-Hebrews. Now, this whole concept of the Jubilee ran into a problem because redeeming debts and redeeming owed land in year 50 meant in year 48, it was really hard to get a loan. Because why would the moneylenders give you money? Because they know you'll just hold off for a year and then the debt is forgiven. And so Rabbi Hillel, who was one of the most famous rabbis of the first century of the Common Era, put out a prose bull, a rabbinic decree that said, in the Jubilee year, the debts become transferred to the court. So those debts don't expire at the Jubilee year, and therefore you do still have to pay them back. So on one hand, it solved the problem of not being able to get a loan. On the other hand, it didn't solve the solution that the earlier writers wanted to cancel all the debts entirely. Can you see a parallel here with the same kind of conversations we're having now about credit card debt and consumer debt and student loan debt? Is it a problem that they got themselves into? Is there an amnesty? Is that the best solution? Or is that reducing the hazard of risk? And what does that do to the creditor? And it's the same dynamics we have today. They're envisioning in biblical legislation of 2,500 years ago. And the extremes as well. This passage from Isaiah 58 is traditionally read as part of the High Holiday liturgy because it says, what's the point of being outwardly pious if you're not doing justice. And justice here is explicitly a question of money. The people of Jacob are sinning, but they seek me daily in verse 2. They ask of me righteous judgment. Why have we fasted, they say, and you don't see? Why have we afflicted our soul and you do not notice? And the answer God gives, in the day of you fast, you find pleasure and oppress all your laborers. You fast for strife and contentions and to strike with the fist of wickedness. Is this the fast I have chosen in verse 5? A day for a man to humble his soul, to bow down like a reed? Is this an acceptable day to Yahweh? No. Isn't this the fast I have chosen? To release the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Isn't it to distribute your bread to the hungry, and that you bring the poor who are cast out into your house? When you see the naked, you cover him. Do not hide yourself from your own flesh. Then you will call, and Yahweh will answer. You will cry for help. He will say, here I am. If, in verse 10, you pour out your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light will rise in darkness and your obscurity be as the noonday. So it's explicitly a question of justice and money and giving it away, not just fasting for outward sake while others suffer. There's a reason why the Shabbat rules say even the servant, even the animals get to rest. There is a real sentiment for the poor. It's not trying to level everything. This is not socialism, but it's compassionate capitalism. The rabbis themselves were very keenly aware of business issues. I'll point out, by the way, many Talmudic rabbis had professions. They had real jobs. They weren't just rabbis. They were sandal makers and tanners and merchants and craftsmen, in addition to being rabbis. So they knew that business and commerce was the way of life, and it had to be managed in some way. They would talk about, how do we manage observing Jewish law if there's a risk of a financial loss? Like, let's say you sell cheese in a shop, but you're going to be closed all through a holiday sequence of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Shabbat, and then the fast of Gedalia on the next day, and you can't be open for 5 days, and all your food is going to go bad. How can we solve that problem so you don't have an overwhelming financial loss that would tempt you to break the law and open up your shop? So they're factoring in the question of economics even to ritual law and practice. You might also be familiar with the concept of selling your chametz. If you're a baker and you run a shop, on Passover, there's a problem because now you're owning all this leavened bread and leavening and yeast. And in theory, it shouldn't be in anything you own. And so the rabbis came up with a temporary contract to sell your chametz, sell your leavened bread for a week to the non-Jew, and then you buy it back after a week, and they get a little something for their concern, but that's the way you make it work. Now, again, it's using money, but it's using money to solve a religious dilemma. And even in rabbinic law, there's a lot of compassion for workers and for the less powerful. We saw earlier in our eye for an eye discussion, thinking about the case of the blind person or the person with one eye, and how would this law apply to them? Understand that halakha, Jewish law, is not just a question of religion. It's also ethics, and it's also commerce and damages and contracts. Now, one of the most famous examples of Jewish grappling with the question of money is Maimonides' ladder of charity, or tzedakah. Tzedakah literally means righteousness, but it often is applied to charity. What does it mean to give charity, and what's the best way to give charity? And then maybe a step down from that. So here we have first the best level of charity, level number 1 at the top of 8. This is the person who strengthens the hand of a poor Israelite by giving him a gift or a loan, or making a business partnership, or finding him work. So the poor person's hand is strengthened until he no longer needs to borrow or beg. Remember the Confucius saying, teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime? That's the highest level of charity, according to Maimonides, is give him a job, and then he doesn't need charity anymore. The next level down, the person who gives tzedakah to the poor doesn't know to whom he is given, and the poor person doesn't know from whom he has received. It's anonymous both ways. There was a secret chamber in the Jerusalem temple where the righteous would give in secret, and the poor of good families could secretly take their support. You'd walk in and drop your money in the box. Someone would come in later, take it out of the box, and nobody knew who was giving and who was receiving. One step down from this is where the giver knows to whom he is given, and the poor person doesn't know from whom he is taken. This is when the sages would go to secretly leave money in the doorways of the poor. So the giver knows who's getting it, but the poor person doesn't know who gave it, and so doesn't feel obligated or shamed in front of them. One step down from this, the poor knows from whom he has taken, but the giver doesn't know. So the sages would wrap their money in their sheets and roll them up behind them and sort of throw it over their shoulder. And the poor would come and take the money. They saw who dropped the money. The rich person didn't see who picked it up, but that way the poor would feel no shame. One step down from this is giving them face to face in his hand, but before you're asked. Secondly, a step down from that would be to give him what's appropriate after being asked. So you wait for the request, give them less than what's appropriate, but with a happy face. And then finally, it's still charity, but you give him less than he deserves and you don't look so happy while you're doing it. Now, these are all different ways to give charity. There are higher and lower levels, but again, we can think about how this applies to Jewish life today. What kind of fundraising do we do in the Jewish community? We often put donors' names on things, right? Well, which level is the donor's name? It's number 4. When the poor knows from whom he is taken, the giver doesn't know who's walking in the John Schmidt entrance, but the poor certainly, the ones who didn't endow that entrance, certainly know who gave the money. So that's one of the challenges in looking back on these idealized rules and then the practical side of how things actually work. Remember, of course, that the people making these decisions, the rabbis, the leaders, the movers and shakers, or the machers in Yiddish, were not the majority of Jews. Most Jews earned a living by working. Even Maimonides didn't earn a living as a rabbi. He was a court physician. There were limitations on Jewish professions in Europe. There were craft guilds. Jews were not allowed to own land. And who really wants to voluntarily become a peasant? So in the end, the Jews served as a kind of middleman, traveling between cities and the countryside. They could be a merchant or simply a craftsman who sold their wares, but because they weren't tied to the land like the serfs, they could go between the towns and the countryside. Sometimes they were specialists in processing raw materials. Believe it or not, Jews had a particular niche as running taverns, where they took the raw agricultural produce and turned it into fermented liquor and sold it back with added value. And sometimes they were the tax collectors or the estate managers for an absentee noble landlord. Of course, nobody likes a tax collector. And there was, of course, the very famous role as a niche in medieval Europe called the moneylender. Remember that rule about do not lend at interest? Well, both Christians and Jews agreed that that meant Jews could not lend at interest to Jews, and Christians could not lend an interest to Christians. But Jews could lend an interest to Christians because they were not brothers in the same way. And so it created a niche for Jews who did accumulate some money through merchants or other kind of work that they did to be able to lend money sometimes to other merchants or entrepreneurs or sometimes even to the rulers, although that could be precarious because if the ruler controlled whether you lived there or not, if he got too much in debt to you, he might just tell you to get lost. So here we have the famous scene from The Merchant of Venice, which is not actually Shylock. If you actually see the play, the merchant is somebody else. But Shylock is the Jew and the moneylender. And in Act 3, people ask him, why do you want to take a pound of flesh out of this person who has lent you money and whose ship seemingly is lost at sea? And Shylock says, I'll bait my hook with it and catch fish. I don't care. I'm doing this for revenge. But don't blame me because you would do it too. He has disgraced me and hindered me $500,000. Laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nations, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we resemble you in that. The villainy you teach me, I will execute. So Shylock comes across in this passage as very human. It seems very reasonable. He's not vilified until you watch the rest of Act 3. Because later on, it becomes known to Shylock that his daughter, Jessica, has fled. And not only fled to marry someone outside of the faith, but she's fled with his money and his jewels. And he gives this very awful speech. Why, there, all the things that are missing. A diamond gone. Cost me 2,000 ducats in Frankfurt. The curse never fell upon our nation till now. I never felt it till now. 2,000 ducats in that and other precious, precious jewels. I would my daughter were dead at my foot and the jewels in her ear. Would she were hearsed at my foot and the ducats in her coffin. And he goes on, oh, my daughter's left me, but my gold, my jewels, because he values the money even more than his daughter. It's ugly. It's ugly. But we know that the moneylender experience was a limited experience. And we also know, remember Tevye's ideal of study? In many families, and this is the case even today in the ultra-Orthodox world, it was the women who worked more than the men. The men studied Torah. The women did the work. They went out to the marketplace. They managed the shop and kept the books. They didn't always get the credit for it. They deserved. But they did the hard work and earned the money. Keep in mind that in a world where Jewish religious status and social status was very precarious, money was perhaps a negotiable source of power. In the Christian context, the book of Timothy, first book of Timothy, chapter 6 says clearly, the love of money is the root of all evil. You think about Christian vows of poverty, well, money was not guaranteed, but it was some power that Jews might be able to accumulate. Now, when we enter the modern period, we have to remember that the Tevye story, Fiddler on the Roof, is not a documentary. It's fiction. And the story is unusual because it's so rural. And if you watch the movie or see the play, Fiddler on the Roof, note how much of his life is changing from modernity and technology. The arrival of a sewing machine, presaging the sweatshops of Jewish factory workers. The train his daughter takes to Siberia. The newspaper that brings in news of the outside world. Even his traveling to America on a steamship. The only way he was able to do it was because of capitalism. Steerage, which is the way most of our ancestors from Eastern Europe came over, those who did come from Eastern Europe, was a byproduct of sending manufactured goods to America. They had empty ships going back. They needed to fill it. They filled it with people for super cheap in the hold of the ship. And so these stories of Tevye's world were already passé. When Sholem Aleichem was writing his Tevye at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, the shtetl was the old country, the old world, the old city. When they had moved to Warsaw, they had moved to Vilna. They weren't in the shtetlach anymore. There were some Jews there for sure, but many Jews, millions of Jews, were no longer there. It was nostalgia, these stories, for the urbanized Jews or the old country for new American Jews. You can tell this by statistics of Jewish professions in this period, in the early 20th century. So here you have a chart that breaks down what percent of Jews and what percent of non-Jews were involved in different kinds of professions. And notice this chart excludes agricultural labor, which would have had very limited numbers of Jews compared to the non-Jewish population. Here we have, for example, in Poland in 1931, 45% of Jews were involved in industry and trade and 44% of non-Jews. That's about comparable. Commerce and credit, 38% of Jews are involved there. Only 9% of non-Jews are in business and lending money. Communications and transport, Jews are less than the general population. Public service and liberal professions, less than the general population. Domestic and personal service, less than the general population. Don't notice how overwhelming they are overrepresented in commerce and credit. You can see the same thing in, look at Romania. If you go down to Romania, 1930. Again, fewer Jews are involved in industry and trade, but 51% of the Jews are involved in commerce and credit compared to 18% for the general population. Same kind of disproportionate result in Czechoslovakia, in Germany, even in Russia. And by the way, this is Russia in the 1920s, after the Soviet Union is in place, and Jews are still overrepresented in commerce and credit. They're business people. That's what they did. Now, the audience that Sholem Aleichem was writing for were garment and factory workers. They were clerks and cabbies and milkmen and grocery store owners. They tended to be on the political left. They had socialist and union sympathies, and it was their kids who would become professionals, who would not go into the family business. They would become pharmacists. They'd become accountants. They'd become lawyers, and often they needed their own firms because they couldn't get hired by the Gentile firms. And then their kids, the kids of those pharmacists and accountants, became doctors and professors and businessmen. And they ultimately moved out of those dense Jewish urban neighborhoods to the suburbs. And what happened then? Well, I'll let the child of two Jewish socialists tell you all about it. in a song from 1962.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. And the people in the houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes, and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. And they all play on the golf course and drink their martinis dry, and they all have pretty children, and the children go to school, and the children go to summer camp, and then to the university where they are put in boxes, and they come out all the same. And the boys go into business and marry and raise a family in boxes made of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same.
That's Melvina Reynolds, child of two Jewish socialist parents who maintained her critique of the capitalist system even later. So where are Jews and money today? Well, here we have a chart based on the Pew Study of Jewish Americans from 2013, which is really illustrative of, we'll call it Jewish success. In education, for example, 58% of the overall Jewish population is a college graduate, compared to 29% of the general public, twice as likely than the general public to have a college degree. And much less likely to only have high school or less. 17% of the Jewish population is high school or diploma or less. Keep in mind, of course, the ultra-Orthodox community often doesn't go to college or get college degrees at all. Compared to the general public, 42% of the general public does not have a college degree. So again, our educational success is striking. The same is true when it comes to money and income. Household income, 25% of the American Jewish population has a household income of $150,000 or more, compared to 8% of the general public. And 17% earn $100,000 to $150,000. Together, that's 42% of the American Jewish population earns over $100,000, compared to 18% of the general population. Now, there, of course, are poor Jews. You see 20% of the Jewish population is earning less than $30,000, which is less than the general public, where 36% earns less than $30,000. But it doesn't mean that all Jews have money. However, it does mean that Jews as a demographic group are higher earners than the general American population. I'll also point out that Israel, which is a relatively small country, is number 22 on the OECD GDP per capita index, which is doing pretty well. Now, is this truth of Jewish economic success in the modern world a tribute to Jewish intelligence, to hard work, and in America to the Ashkenazi Jewish white privilege that they were entitled to because of their white skin? After all, they were eligible for the GI Bill, where African Americans were often not. They were not redlined in the same way, and they were able to move to those little boxes in Levitt towns. and able to build generational wealth in ways that non-whites were less able to do? Or is this Jewish success a sign that the Jews have rigged the system? The Jews are unscrupulous cheaters. The Jews love money because money is the root of evil and they are evil. Well, the same numbers can be read very different ways by an anti-Semitic organization or by the Jewish United Fund of Metropolitan Chicago. The truth is that any information about Jews and money, like money itself, is simply a tool. It can be used for good or for evil, to uplift or to oppress, to help or to hurt. We can encourage tzedakah, give charity. We can make people feel bad that they can't pay the required membership dues if they're not in that upper 42%. There's a system actually called pay to pray. Sometimes people sneeringly call it. We can get caught up on the minutia of selling chametz and honoring donors and forget basic principles like inclusion and human dignity. I'll let you in on a secret that was highlighted in the recent decade by an Israeli scholar of human culture and cultural evolution named Yuval Noah Harari. In his breakthrough book, Sapiens, he points out that money itself is a human invention. There's no ontological reality to provide value to money. It's something we've chosen to value. And so if money is our invention, then let us use this thing we choose to value to express our ethical values and do good with it and not evil. And that is, in the end, the inheritance of Jews and money. It's our choice of how to evaluate this inheritance and how to apply it to the best for human flourishing and success.